That's good. Lovely. Good morning, everybody. Mahaba, bonjour, willkommen, and welcome to day 2 of this WISE Summit. A packed day yesterday, full of invention, comment, enthusiasm. And if there's one emotion I've noticed over the last 48 hours since I've been with you all and meeting you individually, and a great many of you, it's that enthusiasm for education, which is wonderful to behold. Yesterday, we explored interactions between education and other development strategies and how innovation happens in the many different sectors that we were talking about. This morning, we're going to try and go further, so there is some synergy with the session yesterday afternoon to address the question, how do we achieve effective reform in education? In other words, how do we bring improvement to entire school and education systems for all children and not just for a few, not just for the handful? Many countries have increased spending a great deal, but still have not made significant progress. So why doesn't it work if you throw money at it? I'm sure you all know various answers to that question. There you are, 2.46 trillion in education. This morning we're going to address this very important theme first by exploring the goals of so-called whole system reform, whatever that means. And Sir Michael Barber is going to explain to me exactly what that means. In other words, how reform efforts are playing out around the world and how to bring teachers on board. We'll also explore how to balance the roles of education ministries who set the general directions for reform while they're in office, and of teachers in schools who are the ones who, of course, have to implement those and make change happen. Finally, we'll look at whether it might be important to expand the vision for reform to include other stakeholders from the community, and other stakeholders being parents, businesses, etc., and also to focus on different kinds of skills and knowledge. So we're going to try and we will ask our distinguished panel of experts to help us answer most of those questions, time permitting. So would the panel please come up on stage? So, welcome, gentlemen, an all-male crew this morning. Let me introduce them to you. Sir Michael Barber is the Chief Education Advisor at Pearson and former head of the Global Education Practice at McKinsey. I'll be asking him about his efforts to reform education in the UK and his research on how some countries have made large-scale improvements in education. Tom Bentley is Deputy Chief of Staff to Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard and also part-time Director of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government. I'll be asking him about his ideas on different ways of promoting change in education and the public sector and why it's only a part-time job. Luc Chatel is the Minister for National Education in France, and he will share with us the experience of the French government in trying to implement reform. And I'll be asking him how difficult it is for the education system in France and elsewhere when a minister changes. Does the reform stop with the minister? Dr. Shams Qasim Laka is a former Minister of Education in Pakistan and the founding president of the Aga Khan University, as well as member of the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan and founding chair of the board of Pakistan's Centre for Philanthropy. He'll share his insights from many years leading educational change in his country, Pakistan, and his experiences around the world as well. And Dr. Jacek STRZEMIECZNY, co-founder of the Centre for Citizenship Education in Poland. He is a social entrepreneur and has a unique view on how to make change happen. So to start this session, as you probably guessed by now, or people who have heard me before, I'm not keen on jargon. I don't like jargon because it excludes a lot of people and it's protective. So it's important to set out some of the key concepts perhaps in this field, such as what is whole system reform. So let's not mess around and ask Sir Michael straight away, first question, exactly what that means. What is whole system reform?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Whole system reform, actually, although it is jargon, as you quite rightly say, it's also exactly what it says on the tin, as we say in England. It means reforming the whole system. If you look at the history of education reform all around the world in developing countries and developed countries, what you see is very often sets of random initiatives or beautiful little boutique projects or trials or pilots, and some of those work and some of them don't, but they don't change the whole system. Whole system reform is putting together a combination of changes at once at the level of the system in order to transform the learning opportunities of all the children in the system. And what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years in England, in Australia, in Poland, sometimes in France, and now in Punjab in Pakistan, is significant efforts to put all the levers together in one reform that will change the whole system all at once. So rather than boutique project, it's about reforming the whole system. And if I put it in a single phrase, I'd say, let's get beyond the false dichotomies that bedevil education and think about the combinations of teaching and technology, the whole system and personalization, making sure best practice is adopted and innovation, combining the way the public and private sectors work together, and then above all with whole system reform, having the strategy but also the approach to implementation that means the strategy actually gets put into practice and doesn't just sit in a white paper or a document.
Exactly, implementation is the key, but we're not talking just about one school here. How do you do that for 5,000 schools? Why is it not enough to appoint good head teachers to run a well-disciplined school with good teachers focused on the best outcomes? What more is there to system reform than that? And in other words, what are the key components to thinking in that context?
Sure. Well, I mean, you make a good point. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence now that giving schools a considerable degree of autonomy, making sure they've got good head teachers or principals really does matter, and making sure they can control quite a lot of what goes on at the school level. But there are a lot of system level issues. Somebody's got to decide what is the strategy for this country, where would we like to be in 5 or 10 years, and how does that fit with the wider strategy of the country as a whole. Somebody's got to decide where are you going to get the supply of good teachers and good leaders into the system. Somebody's got to decide what standards you want the children to achieve in a globally benchmarked set of education systems as we're now in.
Is that rhetorical, one person, or is that the minister?
No, in a democratic society, it's about the elected government in collaboration with the stakeholders defining those outcomes. You'll come to Tom Bentley, you know that
you have to lead, don't you?
But yeah, the government needs to lead. Each individual school can't make a decision about what Australia or England or Pakistan wants. That's a matter for the country as a whole. And obviously you want to give schools degrees of autonomy in achieving that. And then the final thing I'd say that the system needs to do is it has to set some minimum standards and say, if the standard falls below this, that's not acceptable and we're going to do something about it. And by the way, there's another very big underlying issue, which is the distribution of the funding through the system. It's taxpayers' money. Somebody's got to raise the money. Somebody's got to decide how it's distributed. So if you want a publicly funded system, the taxpayer, the citizen, is going to be interested in the outcomes that that system is going to deliver.
Okay, those are the key components. One last question for you. I mean, there'll be others during the day. And if any of the other panelists want to join in on any of these questions, then please feel free. I'm not just going to talk to Sir Michael, I'm going to bring him in a moment. But last one on this theme to you, Sir Michael. Education needs to learn from other industries. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Education systems should learn from each other and from other industries.
And does it need to be more systematic?
Well, as I was saying earlier on, I think that too much of the history of education reform is about nice little initiatives and boutique projects that change the lives of those involved in them but don't change the whole system. So it does need to be more systematic in that sense, but it's not about a system that crushes innovation. You want whole system reform and innovation. You want best practice and new ways of teaching. You need to get the system to adopt those, and you need to create the incentives to make that happen.
Okay, well, those kind of ideas you're talking about have been important not only in the United Kingdom, but also in many other countries represented here and here. We also have a fantastic panel to talk about those issues and how reform efforts are playing out around the world. Minister Jalal, you come from a country which has the reputation of being very centralized. Still, you're introducing reforms in France to make education more personalized for each learner. First, can you explain very briefly what personalization of learning means in France?
D'abord, je voudrais rebondir sur les propos précédents. Quand on rencontre, lorsqu'on est ministre de l'Éducation, un homologue, c'est le cas, nous nous rencontrons régulièrement. Il y avait la conférence générale de l'UNESCO la semaine dernière, et il y a beaucoup de rencontres entre les ministres de l'Éducation. Chaque ministre vous dit « Je suis en train de réformer l'éducation dans mon pays ». On a l'impression que partout dans le monde, il y a une espèce de réformite aiguë des systèmes éducatifs. Je ne crois pas. Je crois en fait que le système éducatif dans chaque pays a besoin d'un processus de réforme continue, d'adaptation permanente. C'est l'essence même de l'éducation que de s'adapter en permanence au monde d'aujourd'hui. Et tout cela peut se faire au quotidien, j'allais dire à bas bruit. Je dis souvent, il vaut mieux les petits matins quotidiens au grand soir. Et puis de temps en temps, il y a besoin d'une vraie vision pour repenser le système en entier, une vraie vision globale. Ces réformes-là sont évidemment les plus difficiles. D'abord parce qu'on le sait, aujourd'hui c'est difficile de réformer dans tous les pays modernes, et c'est encore plus difficile de réformer l'éducation. Je parlais la semaine dernière avec Laurent Blanc, le sélectionneur de l'équipe de France de football, ancien champion du monde. Et nous disions finalement, nous faisons sans doute tous les deux le métier le plus difficile, parce qu'il y a 60 millions de ministres de l'éducation en France, et il y a 60 millions de sélectionneurs de l'équipe de France de football. C'est pareil, la réforme est difficile. Et je crois que pour réformer le système en entier, comme vous l'avez dit, ça nécessite une réflexion globale et un engagement devant les électeurs. Et je voudrais citer un exemple. En 2007, l'université française n'avait pas été réformée depuis 25 ans. Elle était à la traîne dans les classements internationaux. Et elle n'était pas réputée à côté des universités anglo-saxonnes. Nous avons voulu réformer l'université en profondeur, en la rendant plus autonome, en modifiant sa gouvernance. Ça a été un engagement fort de la campagne présidentielle de 2007. Et Nicolas Sarkozy, élu président, a porté cette réforme immédiatement devant les Français. Donc je crois qu'il y a deux niveaux de réforme. Le quotidien, qui permet de faire beaucoup de choses, et les systèmes éducatifs arrivent à se moderniser de l'intérieur, à condition bien sûr d'y mettre la manière. Mais il y a de temps en temps nécessité de faire appel à des réformes structurelles en prenant l'opinion à part.
That's great. Reformitis, I quite like the idea of that, and people suffering from it. We need to continually adapt. You talk about a global vision. I think that's very difficult, a global vision with so many differences. But you say you're trying to change the system after 2007, which is what President Sarkozy did promise in his manifesto. But I did ask you what personalization meant, and you studiously avoided that. So if you can just tell me what personalization means in France.
Ce que je crois, c'est que le défi majeur aujourd'hui de nos pays, c'est de faire en sorte que chaque jeune qui quitte le système éducatif ait une solution. Pendant longtemps, nous nous sommes engagés sur une quantité, une proportion d'une classe d'âge à tel ou tel niveau d'études. En France, ça a été 80% d'une génération au bac. L'Union européenne s'est engagée à 50% d'une classe d'âge à bac plus 3, au niveau licence. Tout ça, c'est très bien, mais ce qui est important, c'est que les systèmes éducatifs, compte tenu de l'investissement que ça représente pour nos pays, garantissent qu'il y ait en quelque sorte une obligation de résultat pour les parents. Vous mettez vos enfants à l'école, je vous garantis qu'en sortant, votre enfant aura une qualification et un diplôme. Et c'est la meilleure réponse qu'on peut apporter à la crise qu'on connaît dans un certain nombre de pays, notamment crise du chômage des jeunes, de l'emploi des jeunes. Et la seule réponse par rapport à ça, c'est l'idée de personnalisation, c'est-à-dire adaptation du système éducatif à la situation de chaque élève. Personnalisation des parcours, personnalisation des pédagogies, personnalisation du système, c'est-à-dire autonomie.
Okay, autonomy for the students, interesting. Tom Bentley, quickly.
The idea of personalisation is a very important one to pick up on because it links to this idea that you think is not so easy to achieve of a global vision. It came up in one of the videos from Andreas Schleicher of the OECD yesterday when he said that globally one of the most outstanding features of our education systems is the diversity of students. And the idea of personalisation is essentially that we could build education systems which are capable of responding to the individual talents and potential of each of those students. In order to make it a reality, though, you have to combine it with the fact that schooling and education works through systems. They have to have operating procedures and frameworks which are consistent across millions of people and thousands of organisations. And as Michael said, if you want those systems to work properly, they have to have minimum standards and goals and objectives and accountabilities which are consistent across all of that activity. That's the central tension in this discussion about whole system reform, how to bring together the promise of each with the need to deliver for all.
Yeah, that is entirely my view, and you're right to identify that, what I call, and you call, central tension. Dr. Kasim Laka, based on your very wide international experience, what are the conditions necessary for reform?
First of all, I would subscribe to several of the things that my colleagues on this panel have said. If I had to summarize it in probably one sentence, the most important thing for bringing about reform, achieving reforms, the name of our panel, is to have a political will. You can train, you can you can give professional development to the teachers, you can build new facilities, you can bring extraordinary facilities to the library, but if the political will is not there, we won't achieve these. And if we achieve them, they will be in fits and starts. This government or this administration will support it, the next administration puts it on the back burner, and it doesn't happen. So how do we bring about this political will?
How do you bring about consistency, is what you mean?
And how do we have a long-term vision? And I think it's a very critical point. When President de Gaulle created a long-term vision for, or at least presented a long-term vision for France, he had 3 or 4 ideas that this is something that's going to be important.
I mean, that's something you hear from teachers, not just in Pakistan, but France, the UK, everywhere, that you get a new Minister for Education, and suddenly you get a new initiative.
That's right.
An initiative is something that solves a problem for the day, and the problem goes away, but of course it doesn't.
Well, so the problem is that ministers are usually elected for 4 or 5 years. They have given all kinds of speeches to the public, say, we promise you this. When it comes to delivery, they have to come along and deliver. The most difficult reforms to deliver today are education and health. Ask Mr. Obama, he will confirm all of that. Ask President Sarkozy, he will confirm it. And the point is that if we don't have political will that coalesces, now the way to create that political will is to give a vision for the longer term, mobilize the public, but most of all, mobilize the faculty, mobilize those who are delivering education. And I just say this from my experience that in 2001, when President Musharraf asked me to head a team that was going to look at reforms in higher education. He said, I will support you. And I said, only thing I ask from you is political will. And he said, I'll stay with that.
Political support.
Political support. And that then resulted in some money coming into education. But to create conditions for the politicians to support that, I had to go around with my colleagues to about 70-odd fora of faculty members, parents, students, and sit with them and mobilize a sense that we need to. And the biggest opponents at that time were the faculty members, because they were unsure what will happen to them. Once you get them on board...
People on the whole don't like change.
They don't.
Anybody else want to come in on this point? Because this is very important. So, Michael.
Just on the political will point, just very briefly, I do think that is very important, and that there are... Obviously, you can't, there's no substitute for democracy, so it will sometimes throw up changes of government, of course. But I think there are two things. One is, in our McKinsey study, we showed that the most successful improving systems had political leaders in position for their education reform lasting about 6 years. If you look at the history of England, we've had a change of Secretary of Education, Secretary of State for Education, roughly every 2 years since 1945. Yeah. I've known 12 of them over a 24-year period, at least one of them
This
in
is
the
my
audience.
point entirely.
So that does make it difficult.
And this is teachers' points
but you
entirely
need,
as well.
Therefore, to get a in the 21st century, you need a national story about how education is part of the change of that country that transcends political parties. And then you need to get some results that give people confidence that you're on the right track.
Jacek, you want to come in?
Yes. We have the same experience in Poland. I'm from NGO organization, and we've been able to state with our consistent way, with our policy of educational change for 20 years. And at the same time, we have 10 ministers of education in Poland, which almost as a rule didn't follow their predecessor policies. So we have to a little bit back up and not to wait, especially as educators, not to wait for government to initiate reforms. We have to do something very often by ourselves. And it can be done on the beginning as an innovation in your school or establishing small, local, something new, but later to think about how you can influence whole educational system with it. So to become someone to think about yourself who is changing education from bottom up, not waiting for, because we have political will or we don't have. Our politicians are under their own restraints.
Okay, so what do you put your own success down to? The Polish school system is one of the most envied in the world, isn't it, with the PISA ratings that I was looking at? And you did it by, what, creating a middle school idea?
Yes, it happened by, in fact, political will. It happened because politicians decided that we want to extend compulsory system, make them longer for every student to be in the same compulsory system before we divide them like for vocational schools and for academic more track of learning. And this is really role of central government to set up right system, but later to give space for other actors. And we've been talking about it,
exactly.
Other actors.
Minister, you want to come in?
Oui, je voudrais rebondir sur la méthode de la réforme. Vous disiez tout à l'heure, à juste titre, que la France avait un système très centralisé, historiquement très centralisé. Et il faut bien imaginer qu'on ne peut pas tout réformer d'en haut en débloquant le système d'en haut. On a besoin aussi de donner des marges de manœuvre aux acteurs locaux et de faire confiance grâce à l'expérimentation. Je crois beaucoup à l'expérimentation. En France, nous essayons de déployer des expérimentations dans des domaines très variés. Je vous prends un exemple. Nous avons en ce moment 300 collèges en France qui sont dorénavant autonomes dans le recrutement de leurs professeurs, dans leurs projets pédagogiques. Si j'avais dit nous allons rendre autonomes 100% des collèges de France et nous allons faire recruter les professeurs par les chefs d'établissement, j'avais une mobilisation générale et le blocage du pays. Nous passons par l'expérimentation, nous allons évaluer cette cette expérimentation et quelque chose me dit, l'enquête McKinsey que vous avez réalisée, que cette direction n'est pas forcément la plus mauvaise.
Indeed. Very, very briefly, Jacek, because I sort of moved on a bit, tell us a little about the Center for Citizen Education, Citizenship Education. Very briefly, just tell us what it does.
We started about 20 years ago with realization that in Poland we need much more civic competency for young people. And we know that we wouldn't accomplish this through traditional teaching methods, through just lecturing students and testing them about if they understand the concept of democracy, for example, or civic participation. We need projects which would put young people in their local community to do something significant, and they would learn by doing. So we start with variety of projects, first for civic and later for every school subject, because there is widely known that engagement of students is very important for their ability to successfully learn, and this is what we are about. So to find instructions which can really empower students by exposing them for authentic learning possibilities.
Thank you, Jens. The point of today is effective reform, how you achieve it. Tom Bentley, you're working at the heart of government in Australia. Can you describe some current reforms there?
Certainly. And I might try and say briefly, some of the characteristics which we're trying to develop, which I think might become features of the kind of next generation of system reforms, and how we can make the models more effective. One of the most important, possibly for me, the central dimension of a system of education which is capable of learning from itself and continuously improving is transparency. And so in the long-term reform strategy that the Australian government is pursuing, increasing transparency for professionals and policymakers, but also for the wider community, is fundamental. So,
what do you mean transparency? Between whom?
The core example that I'll describe is a website. So it's a use of digital technology to provide information to any user. It's free to the public to give as much information as possible about the characteristics of each school and the performance of each school, and then year by year, as the technology and the analytics improve, also to be able to explain and present the progress of students and the ways in which to interpret that progress when comparing the school against other schools that serve similar communities, and to understand the value that teaching and school leadership might be adding to the progress of those students. So in Australia, which is a well-developed country with a relatively high-performing school system, nonetheless, when this government, federal government, came to office, all these kids going to school and all these parents having basically similar experience, but no common base of information about how those schools were resourced, what was happening in them, or how they might be performing. So it's a simple website called My School, but it took a lot of political negotiation to win agreement from all the relevant authorities, the non-government school systems, the states, because Australia is federal, in order to bring that about. But the innovation, the kind of structural change that was created, then allows a much more evolutionary change to keep happening, which central governments don't have to try and drive every detail of, because people can access this information and then decide what use they want to make of it.
So reform through the website?
Yeah.
Virtual reform?
It's a way of enabling reform and innovation by helping to connect together these different efforts and enabling people to think about how specific initiatives might be translated into larger scale change.
Okay. Do you want to make a point before we move on?
I'd like to support that idea, and I would like to suggest two types of reforms that, especially in developing countries, we have seen make a major difference. One relates to the governance structures, whether it's schools or universities. Where governance does not work, then the head of the school or head of the university is not able to be held accountable, and so the faculty and so forth. There is a saying, I'm told in Chinese, that a bad fish smells at the head. You want to buy a fish, you smell at the head. If it is smelly, you know it is bad. So it starts at the governance. It's no good us putting another library or another physical facility if the accountability and performance mechanism is not there. The second one is at a much lower level, and yet it is at a much broader level. And in developing countries, because many delegates are here from developing countries, I have found that the examination system in many countries is weak. Why is it weak? Because the examination system tests memory, tests for rote learning ability. Whereas a good exam system will want you to look at not just the factual knowledge, but its application and conceptualization. And to bring that change, the Aga Khan University, I'm just giving you a specific example, presented to the government of Pakistan a plan to have its own examination system. And that was done about 15 years ago. It took 10 years of different administrations to say, this looks like a good idea, but it never moved up because the public sector examination systems were not effective and they were opposing. Once the new private sector examination came in eventually, that became a role model. So the bottom line is create good role models, create good benchmarks, and you may be able to get better reforms.
That was far and wide-ranging, Professor, but I want to probe a little more to understand how reform, that's what today is about, or this session is about, reform, and how you make effective reform, how to understand how it works, and perhaps what some people see as some of its limitations. First, if you want to bring new and innovative practices to thousands of schools, clearly the central government needs to be involved. I think we're agreed on that. At the same time, teachers may resist changes imposed on them. A change of government, change of minister, why should I go with this change next week? There might be another change in the pipeline. Teachers who you describe as working at the ground or bottom level also need to have their say about innovation and change. So the question is there a better way to balance this kind of whole system reform by teacher-led innovation? Help us start this discussion. Let's look at a clip from an interview with Professor Dr. Fasli Jalal, former Vice Minister of Education in Indonesia.
First, I think we have to consider the magnitude of the reform. If too big, you have to have the stepwise planning and stepwise implementation. And you have to find the inner champion of this reform, either from a school master or from teachers themselves. So you have to find supporter of the reform and do stepwise of the implementation. Second, I think the very important thing about the financial implication, because for us it's really huge, but I think the outcome of learning process also equal importance to the student, to the parents, and to the public. And last but not least, I think reform can only be implemented if the teachers understand and feel on board. They feel this reform is for them and will be done by them and on their own term.
Well, that's very clear. They will be done by them and on their terms. Minister Chattel, how important is it to bring teachers with you? In other words, if you are bringing teachers with you, how have you achieved that, or what is the best way to achieve that?
Je crois qu'il y a deux écueils à éviter. D'abord, en démocratie, je pense qu'on ne réforme pas durablement contre le gré des peuples. C'est à ça que servent les élections, d'ailleurs, à valider un certain nombre d'orientations et de caps. Donc, je crois que c'est très important que sur les questions d'éducation, elles soient débattues, partagées au moment des grands rendez-vous électoraux. Moi, je me réjouis qu'en France, par exemple, manifestement, au cours de la prochaine élection présidentielle, les principaux candidats souhaitent mettent sur la table les questions d'éducation. C'est une bonne nouvelle. Donc, on ne peut pas prendre de front les enseignants pour réformer l'éducation. Ça n'est pas possible. Et à l'inverse, je crois que le système qui consiste à tout co-gérer avec les enseignants n'est pas un bon système. Vous disiez tout à l'heure, la France est un système centralisé et qui avait une habitude pendant trop longtemps qui a consisté à co-gérer le ministère de l'Éducation. C'est-à-dire que le ministre, en permanence, discutait avec les syndicats et décidait avec eux. Il y avait même des représentants des syndicats qui étaient au ministère, dans le bureau, au cabinet du ministre. Ce système est révolu et je crois qu'il est d'une autre époque. Il n'est pas sain. Je crois qu'il faut un bon dialogue permanent avec les organisations syndicales, des concertations, mais à un moment, c'est au pouvoir politique d'arbitrer et de porter une réforme avec, ce qu'a dit le collègue indonésien est intéressant, avec des relais. On ne peut pas réformer tout seul. Il faut qu'il y ait un degré d'adhésion et il faut des soutiens dans l'opinion.
Exactly. I have to say, making education a priority is a very popular election promise, not just by the French, but by many governments around the world, not least in the United Kingdom. Sir Michael, in your latest work, you describe how several school systems have improved from fair to good and from good to great. Is there a best way to balance the role of central government and teacher autonomy?
I don't think there's one simple model of it, but I do think there's some clear lessons about this. One thing we should pick up, just picking up on Shams's point, that developing systems and developed countries, the strategies that are going to improve them are somewhat different, because the strategy needs to vary according to the capacity of the existing teacher force. Where do they come from? What skills do they have? What have they learned in the past? So that's one thing. But this challenge of change with a large graduate, often mostly graduate workforce in most countries, does make the relationship between government and teachers very challenging. And we know with any group, large group, there's a tendency to defend things as they are. And to me, there are 3 or 4 things that really make a difference. One is, if you can demonstrate success. If you look around the world and look at our reports, you find that the systems that are highly successful, young people want to go into teaching, the teachers feel good about being teachers, they're praised in the society, that builds more success. So if you can get to that kind of nirvana, that's great. If you're going through a reform, I think there are 3 things that really matter. The quality of communication, not just through the news media, but direct to teachers and the workforce, the quality of that. I think when I look back on the reform in England, we should have done more of that and better. Tom and I were there together. We could have done that much better than we did.
A bit more clarity of thought, yeah, perhaps, and expression.
Why does this matter, and why are we doing it, and what's this about the future of the United Kingdom or England or whatever it might be? So that's one thing. The second is, you need to really focus on the core elements of the strategy and not have a lot of distractions. In the Ontario education reform, which has been very successful over the last 8 years, they have a phrase about removing the distractors, taking away the things that get in the way of focusing on the strategy. And then the third thing is being very clear about the priorities and not changing them over a significant period of time, so that even if at the beginning teachers don't like them, they know there's nothing else coming. This is the agenda. And then behind that, building the capacity of the teachers to do the new job that you're asking of them. So investing in their professional skills, not with a one-off training program, but really investing in their collective capacity. That's what has worked really well in Ontario. I think we began to get that right at different times in England. You see that happening as part of the reform in Australia currently. In the reform that I'm working with in Punjab in Pakistan, a big investment in supporting teachers to teach better lessons, investing in their skills, checking that they're then using those new skills. So getting buy-in from teachers is not easy. And if you try to get everybody bought in at the beginning of the process, you'll wait a long time. But if you get the process going and it begins to work, then you'll find that the teachers will come with you.
Yeah, well, taking teachers with you is the key again. I want to see, you mentioned Andreas Schleicher. I think, was it Tom Bentley who mentioned Andreas Schleicher, the director of the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment. Let's hear what he has to say about the most important elements of successful reform, building on what Sir Michael has said.
Yeah, what's interesting is you can look at systems that are very, very different in their cultural context, in their educational development, but they still do have a lot in common. Those systems set, first of all, very high expectations on what students should be able to do. They don't tell teachers what to teach. They expect it from the profession, but they're very clear about what good performance is, what competency is like. And at the same time, they provide very, very strong support for students, for teachers. They don't leave students and teachers alone with those challenges, but they build very, very strong support systems around this. That's one common dimension. The second dimension is there's a lot of professional responsibility at the point of delivery in schools, in instructional environments. Teachers have a lot of responsibility, but they also have a lot of professional autonomy within a collaborative culture. They're not left alone, but there's a lot of responsibility. At the same time, the counterpart to this is the system is able to intervene inverse in proportion to success. What I mean by this is that the system can figure out where it needs to help, and it can intervene in a targeted way. You don't have systems that tell everybody what to do, but the system is actually able to zoom in where support is important and needed. The third dimension, very important as well, is the capacity of systems to understand and engage with diversity. So good teachers know that students learn differently, different students learn differently and at different stages in their life. And they're actually able to sort of embrace that diversity with differentiated pedagogical strategies.
Tom Bentley, you've worked inside government and outside it as well. What do you think about what Andreas Schleicher said there, his shopping list?
I think his shopping list is very sophisticated, but I have to say that I have some reservations and some qualms about our ability collectively and the ability of policymakers to craft institutional strategies that can really deliver that sophistication. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is, as Michael said, large groups will resist change and try and defend their status quo. But the institutional systems that run education are almost all coordinated by public bureaucracies by necessity, but also made up of these many different organizations, regional bodies, school boards, intermediary structures. In every country, and I think that this is a common feature between developed and developing nations, in every country those systems are adept at resisting change without any kind of explicit direction. It's part of their resilience that they can absorb the changing tides of politics and social change. Of course, there are sometimes moments of great and radical change, of disruption and revolution, but those moments are not the norm.
No, they're few and far between.
Absolutely. So, and of course, the majority of educators, of teaching professionals in any country are also committed to their vocation. They don't think of themselves as, lazy rent seekers or resistors of change. They're genuine in their motivations. So my reservation, my problem essentially is that however sophisticated, however great, however visionary your leadership, if you try to work through the layers and the steps and the incremental changes of bringing this consistency and dedication to our default systems, our current institutional settings, then the momentum for change inevitably peters out. And the people who don't benefit enough from it are usually the people who are on the edges of those systems who are not benefiting from them currently.
You brought us to an important point, because what we've started to discover is what does work for different systems. If we want to balance top-down and bottom-up, the challenges in Pakistan are going to be very different from those in Australia and Poland. Dr. Kasim-Laka, looking at the challenges that you've met, how much can and should it learn from other systems, and how much has to be homegrown? In other words, how much has to come from leadership and how much from teachers and civil society? For example, the Citizens Foundation as an agent, a catalyst for change.
Well, I think you're making a very good point. How much should come from outside and how much should be indigenous? I think the people within the country should feel these are our reforms and not something that has been encouraged by, imposed by a donor agency or by a friendly country, because that's the best way to kill off the sense of ownership. So the important part is we have to, whoever is helping to create reforms, whether they are operations like the ones that Sir Bentley Michael is organizing, Michael Barber is organizing, or anyone else. We have to create a momentum within. That momentum starts with teachers, who then speak to the parents on our behalf. We speak to the parents as policymakers.
But do teachers have any power?
Oh, we have to empower them. If we don't empower teachers and head teachers...
That's another hour-long debate on its own.
That's absolutely. And if we don't empower them, we are going to be dead in the water.
Okay. Let's go to Jacek. Looking at Poland now, there's been obviously this very big increase in performance in Polish schools, in results. What would be needed to make more progress, to balance the roles of the central ministry and those in schools that we've just heard from Dr. Kasin?
Now we very often talk about social capital, and we want to increase social capital in our local community and to figure out how we can develop skills which can help and attitudes which are important for social capital. And we should also about social capital within school, in school.
Social capital, what's that mean?
So it means trust, cooperation. It means care by teachers, for students, that is place for it. And it's very often when top-down reforms with very good intention, but when they go through different layers of administration, they get very bureaucratic one, and they are implemented only on a superficial way. So even if central government wants to, teachers care better about students, and central government wants to have better instruction, is going through this administration here. When power relationship is involved between administration and schools, it distorts a lot of information. So I think that this is place for other institutions like non-governmental organization or sometimes academia, sometimes local community to really interact with schools, and government should leave space for it. In their reform, when they set up system, they should be in such a way decentralized or give autonomy for teachers, school principals.
Governments aren't very good at leaving space.
Yeah,
they like to micromanage.
Yeah, but
so
this is
what... That's unlikely to happen, isn't it, Jacek?
Yeah, the central government is some way selfish. They want, we would do reform. We know what is good, and they are doing this top-down. And there is place for non-governmental organizations when we can experiment with something. It's much more cost-effective when non-governmental organization is working with schools because there is learning loop between school and outside agency which can trying to help the school. So we can craft our tools for schools which are better suited to particular conditions than it is very difficult to do is for government, even for school administration, to help schools. We need others to help schools.
I'm going to come to a sort of final question in a moment. But Minister, you obviously want, very briefly, if you would, because then I want to take what you have to say, and then Tom Bentley, about Tom thinks most good learning takes place outside schools, which is interesting. But Minister, very briefly, if you would.
Juste pour rebondir, je vais peut-être dénoter, mais moi je vais vous dire, je pense que l'enseignant dans sa classe, le proviseur, le chef d'établissement, il est plus qualifié qu'avec le respect que je leur dois, le recteur, le ministre, pour savoir quelle est la pédagogie qui doit être adaptée aux élèves qu'il a dans sa classe. Et donc je pense que le bon système, c'est celui qui a un bon équilibre entre les orientations nationales, et je suis dans un pays qui a choisi que l'éducation soit nationale, et pas transférée aux collectivités locales, à des États. Donc l'État est là pour fixer le cap, pour offrir des garanties, des diplômes nationaux, le recrutement des enseignants au niveau national, des examens nationaux, ça c'est très important, mais fixer le cap et laisser des marges de manœuvre pour différencier la pédagogie et l'adapter à la diversité, l'hétérogénéité qu'on évoquait tout à l'heure, compte tenu de la massification du système éducatif.
Okay. Exactly, room to maneuver, that's the space that Jacek talked about. Tom Bentley, basically you say whole system reform has to embrace not just school but community at home, which is repeating basically what Jacek said. So no argument there.
No argument there. I mean, in one sense, when you think about children and youth and their development, I think in any country, a child will still spend most of their waking hours outside of school hours. And so it's the wider environment as well as the institution of school that we need to think about in shaping their learning potential. But the second crucial point, and I think it has come out of the discussion, is when we talk about systems now, we have to have a broader view of what the system is, understanding the home, the parent, the community, the online network, the employer, the private sector. And then we have to be systematic about trying to forge those connections across those different elements in order to drive and support a vision of learning.
Many disparate elements, you've got to put them together. So Michael, before you repeat that, because you may well include this, I'm going to give you 30 seconds each, because I wanted, yesterday we didn't take anybody online or from the audience, and we're running out of time because the quality of this debate is so good. Give me in 30 seconds, starting with Sir Michael, 30 seconds please only, gentlemen, your best direction for achieving effective reform.
Okay, well, it's a great question. Look, I think picking up Tom's last point, the role of a government is to make sure that everybody gets educated to a new, higher standard in the 21st century and that happened in the 21st century, not to run the public system. So the role of government is to ensure that everybody in the society gets educated, certainly all the children and young people, and ultimately all the adults as well, not just to run a public system. And that leads to a couple of conclusions. One is, I agree with a key point in Andreas's point, that professional autonomy needs to be within a collaborative culture. So how do you create that culture within the teaching profession? And then the people leading reform at the centre, the government, should be creating challenges to the public system. They should be inviting, for example, charter schools, or in Pakistan, low-cost private schools, to provide a challenge to the system. So you're not relying on one monopoly provider. And then in this out-of-school area, you really need to create the kind of social capital that was referred to by our Polish colleague. And last point I want to make on aid. Aid programs should support country-led programs. So you want a great country-led reform that aid supports, not a great aid program.
Minister, your 30 seconds magic wand for achieving effective reform.
30 secondes pour réformer l'éducation nationale française, bon courage. Non, je considère que, d'abord, les systèmes éducatifs, contrairement aux caricatures, ne sont pas irréformables. Moi, quand je suis devenu ministre de l'Éducation nationale, tout le monde m'a dit bon courage, en me disant c'est impossible. Non, je pense que les systèmes éducatifs sont réformables. D'abord, comme je le disais au début, ils s'adaptent en permanence et, contrairement aux caricatures, les enseignants sont parfois les premiers à demander ces adaptations, à demander une modernisation du système, à demander une évolution pour s'adapter au monde qui les environne. Simplement, il y a un certain nombre de conditions, il y a un mouvement permanent et puis de temps en temps, il y a nécessité de réforme systémique, mais qui doit faire l'objet d'une adhésion. Voilà. On ne peut pas réformer contre, on ne peut pas réformer de front, et donc il y a nécessité d'adhésion. Ça peut être adhésion via les élections, ça peut être adhésion via un processus de concertation massif auprès des enseignants et des parents d'élèves. Et voilà comment je vois le processus de réforme permanente et continue.
Okay. Everybody needs to be on board. Yeah, we're finding a common theme here, Jacek.
We have to inculcate in our reforms much more energy of individual teachers and school principals. And we use a notion in Poland, learning school. So in school, the teachers are working collaboratively. They look at results. They look how they are working with students, and together to find culture within school and with help outside school. So teachers could work together and really focus on the learning process, how learning process is going on for students.
Okay. Tom Bentley?
Well, we've agreed on many dimensions, but one that I might just try to focus on as getting to the essentials of how you achieve effective reform and how you keep it moving goes back to this question of political vision and how you mobilize in order to sustain change. Of course, it's true that you need political leadership and consistent vision, but the politicians who stay a long time in office are the ones who learn how to create legitimacy for what they're doing, as well as how to kind of use their political capital to make specific changes. And in education, I think that means building, mobilizing support for the idea that these dramatic improvements are possible. In fact, they're necessary, and politically refusing to take no for an answer, but at the same time staying open as to the means so that new innovations and new sources of energy and dynamism can come into focus over time. And I think that's a rare combination, but it's very potent when you can have it.
Okay. Dr. Shams?
I'm going to move a little bit away from achieving reforms to achieving reforms in a very important area, which is curriculum. We haven't talked about it. In developing countries, there is a great desire by governments and people to include science in curriculum and strengthen that curriculum, because that's the future.
Yep, this is a point well made yesterday afternoon, by the way.
Right, and how do we achieve that objective? Last night, while I was with Dr. Vartan Grigorian, he made a point, and I must give him credit for this. He said that technology is easily adapted and adopted by developing countries or anywhere else. It's easier to adopt. Why don't we use the Trojan horse of technologies to smuggle in science? Worthwhile thought.
Yep, I like that very much. Let's put the lights. Let's get a couple of questions from the floor to involve you. Now, immediately I see number 4. So if you do ask a question, I don't want a statement, otherwise I'll cut your microphone. I assure you that. We haven't got time for statements or, you know, your CV. Can I just have your name and who you want to ask the question of?
Tulicka from Poland. Reform based on standards and tests and accountability lasts with us for a few decades. What do you think about their effects? For example, in the United States, research done by Schatt and Cooper has shown that the students' achievements were lower. In the first decade of this century, Linda McNeil in the USA said the same. Even David Cameron in England last year has said that the achievements of English students are worse and worse. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. So we had a government that came in and said education, education, education. 13 years later, the illiteracy rates are higher than ever. So Jacek, do you reply to your countrywoman?
Yes, I think that this is now time to divert from the thinking about this testing system as a driving force. And we agree, almost everyone, we don't know how to really to empower students and teachers. This is the direction.
Okay, so Michael?
All systems need to know how well the children are doing at different ages. I think what the reform currently being introduced in Australia, for example, is a good example. Testing children aged 7, 9, 11 and 13 is a good idea if you keep the tests clear and simple. What happened in England is that standards improved and then didn't carry on improving as fast. It's not true to say that there are more people illiterate now than 13 years ago. On the contrary, the system is on the whole improved. It should have improved faster. That's the issue.
Okay. I'm going to take question 3 as a last question because we ran out of time, but I did say she or he could ask it, and I don't want to go back on that.
Okay, Stephen Harris, Australia. Online learning has been touched on by people. We're told that by 2020, 60% of American secondary schools will be actually taught online. What's online learning going to do to education reform if it brings learning right down to the bedroom and does away with schools?
Great question. Tom?
I don't think online learning will do away with schools, even though occasionally I might wish it did. Online learning can add value to every dimension of the learning process, and it can also support this kind of, the supportive infrastructure that improves quality and enriches assessment and empowers each individual learner and teacher to think harder and learn more deeply about what they're doing. But it's not going to have any of those effects automatically, and it has to be worked into the broader strategies that we've been talking about.
So you're talking again about gradual change. Thank you. I hope people here are a little clearer about how to achieve effective reform. Perhaps what you've heard has sparked an idea here or online. Take those ideas to a headmaster or to your school board or your community representative. You can also continue the conversation on MyWise or Twitter. I wouldn't mind taking a look at my school, which sounds very interesting. Talking about curriculum, bringing science in under cover of darkness, so to speak. Everybody's agreed everybody has to be on board for change. Accountability and performance was mentioned. We now have a full day of wise debates and focus sessions looking at key elements of reform, at such important issues as how to support and empower teachers, how to motivate and engage learners, and what we can learn from the game changers and many more sessions. And we look forward to exploring those issues with you. My thanks to Sir Michael Barber, Tom Bentley, Shamd Kasim Laka, Luke Chattel, Minister, thank you, Jacek STRZEMIECZNY. Please leave your headsets on your seat. Next session starts at 10:30 a.m. 4 debates under the theme, Learning from Best Practices. I've enjoyed being with you. Thank you.